This is the Black Information Network Daily Podcast, and I'm your host, Ramses Ja. And sometimes the amount of stories that make their way to us means that we simply can't cover everything that comes our way. But from time to time, a story just stays with me, and I feel compelled to share it with you and give you my thoughts. And now, one more thing. All right, so you know that I have certain things that I just need to talk about. And this week, I have to preface what you're about to hear with a disclaimer. I will be anticipating in today's conversation, speaking to lots of internet trolls. So what we're gonna listen to is Don Lemon, a CNN anchor. He's talking with a woman named Hillary Fordwich, and basically he's asking her about, since the Queen's death, the conversation of reparations has come up, and she has some interesting thoughts in a very, very interesting way of distancing the colonizers from a shared history by all accounts. And really sort of muddying the line. And it's very interesting. So let's get into it.
Some people want to be paid back, and members of the public are wondering, why are we suffering when you are, you have all of this vast wealth? Those are legitimate concerns.
Well, I think you're right about reparations in terms of if people want it, though, what they need to do is you always need to go back to the beginning of a supply chain. Where was the beginning of the supply chain? That was in Africa. And when across the entire world, when the slavery was taking place, which was the first nation in the world that abolished slavery? The first nation in the world to abolish it. It was started by William Wilberforce, was the British. In Great Britain, they abolished slavery. 2,000 naval men died on the high seas trying to stop slavery. Why? Because the African kings were rounding up their own people. They had them on cages waiting in the beaches. No one was running into Africa to get them. And I think you're totally right. If reparations need to be paid, we need to go right back to the beginning of that supply chain and say who was rounding up their own people and having them handcuffed in cages. Absolutely. That's where they should start. And maybe, I don't know, the descendants of those families where they died in the high seas trying to stop the slavery, that those families should receive something too, I think, at the same time.
It's an interesting discussion, Hillary. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay. So now you see what I mean. The capacity of conservatives to conflate issues is astounding. And my hope is that Don Lemon simply ran out of time, because obviously there's a lot that needs to be added to that. That's a very, very one-sided view of a 300 plus year history between Great Britain and, I live in America, so I know that version of history, and the African continent. And again, conflating the blame, the beneficiaries, etc., is it's a very limp-wristed approach to addressing slavery and the legacy of slavery. So we'll talk about this today. Again, I apologize in advance because I have done my best to anticipate what folks might say on the internet. Which is not necessarily the reason you tune into the show, but I'll do my best to be as concise as I can. So, one thing that jumps out at me is that she thinks that you should go back to the supply if you're searching for reparations. So I'll make a couple of points right now. The foremost fundamental, foundational economic principle of supply and demand is that supply follows demand. So to say, oh, we need to go back to the supply starts the story in the middle rather than at the beginning. It's, again, a way of distancing herself, or really the history of her people, from their responsibility, the atrocities that they committed, right? By saying, oh, we need to go back to the supply. No, let's figure out what the demand looks like. You know, a thought experiment that I pondered discussing today is, let's add one more word to this scenario. Let's add the word sex just before the word slave. Okay? Because that's something that, for the most part, everyone who is a decent person has enough empathy to imagine what the implications are, what the responsibilities are. When it's, you know, just people who are Black in Africa, you know, the world has conditioned its people. You know, we should be specific. A handful of very wealthy and privileged white men in our history have created the world overwhelmingly in their image right before everyone's eyes. And so lots of white men, especially, who were born and live now, are beneficiaries of it. And so a lot of those people who have racist ideas and racist tendencies have it honestly. You know, they didn't learn to value themselves over other people. And they'll say that they don't. But it's very difficult for them to empathize, to understand, to have any additional perspective, because they were born into a world that just kind of favors them. And this is something I try to bear in mind when I deal with, you know, people who are on the internet. You know, it's like kind of like, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. But yes, you know, there are, there's a history there that is very much problematic. So the word sex, we'll introduce the word sex just so that it adds a layer that allows it to be more approachable to people who cannot appreciate the full value of the word African. Okay. So sex. So let's have an imaginary scenario. Let's rewrite history a bit. I want you to follow me. In Africa, there are sex slaves. Okay. This is wrong. There's no one that would say it's not wrong. Okay. And to give you a little bit of context why there are sex slaves in Africa, let's say that warring tribes, rather than committing genocide, mass slaughter of the opposite tribe, they would take in the people of the tribe that they had conquered. And those people would become sex slaves. All right. Again, this is an imaginary history. But they also knew that they could themselves be the victim of another warring tribe and ultimately become sex slaves themselves. Right. Hear me out. So this really reflects the origins of slavery, real slavery in the real world. Right. Now, let's say some foreigners come to Africa, and these foreigners have guns, and they have, you know, things that, you know, are useful to Africans that have been developed elsewhere in the world. And Africans can trade what it is that they grow there locally. And these foreigners also find out, hey, you guys have sex slaves. Could we buy those sex slaves? They're not illegal where we're from, which, by the way, for anyone that wants to respond, bear in mind that just because something is legal, or rather not illegal, doesn't make it right. But I'll continue. Let's say, for instance, these folks come and they say, wow, you have sex slaves. I'd like to buy some of those sex slaves. I think I can turn a profit on those sex slaves in my home country, Great Britain, in Americas, wherever else, South America, the islands and the Caribbean, etc. Thereby giving birth to the transatlantic sex slave trade. And then the people in those countries purchase the sex slaves. Okay, I'm gonna stop this. Okay, I just want you to think. Okay, now who all's wrong here? Okay, yes, selling a person is an awful thing to do. Okay, and that is the extent of the crime in Africa. Owning a person, denying them their identity, their language, their humanity. The slavery, as I've mentioned on this show before, slavery is something that has existed since the beginning of people, right? And we, as a species, have had to evolve beyond that. So that means all of us, every part of the world, every corner of the world, right, has had to evolve beyond that. But the slavery in the Americas, especially, was a very specific type of slavery. Imagine someone saying, you cannot pray to your God. I remember seeing a comment and someone was like, well, some of the other slaves weren't, considered people. Not to the same degree rather than African slaves in the Americas. And again, there was lots of different things put together that made American slavery very different, which is why American slavery has a very different legacy. But I'll move on now that you perhaps can empathize a bit more, that we've changed the word African to the word sex. Okay, so now I'm going to make my points. Again, in Africa, this woman, Hillary Fordwich, she says, let's go back to the supply. Then she made a comment at the end saying like 2,000 soldiers died trying to remedy what, their ancestors started. And they deserve reparations too, completely glossing over the fact that reparations was paid to slaveholders in Great Britain and in the Americas. Okay. That's why these countries went into debt. Okay. So imagine that, her asking, well, these families need some money. Okay. All right. So, let's go back to supply. Slave ships started coming to Africa once a month, and they would visit different ports along the African coastline, the west coast of Africa, because they needed to fill up their ships. This is economics, right? So slaves became the main export for a while, again, to follow the demand. And, these tribes warring against each other, going to battle, this is a thing that happens, again, throughout all of humanity. Were given horses, weapons, you name it. So that they're thinking they can protect themselves from being enslaved by selling the people that they've conquered as slaves. Okay. So again, left to its own devices, Africa would have had, its own path to walk. Absent the European influence, absent the desire to avoid manual labor, the greed, or capitalistic greed, we'll call it. Africa would have been left to its own devices and would have followed likely the path that many other places around the world followed, in terms of how do they deal with human beings, right? What happened once the slaves left Africa was very different. Not to mention Africa itself entered into agreements with countries, white countries, European countries, and were exploited and robbed and, treaties violated and land taken by force and on and on and on. This list goes, which is why Africa is largely in the state that it's in today. some African countries can never get out of debt based on laws imposed or conditions of loan terms, or because those countries owe reparations to European countries. Again, I've said this before on the show. It's interesting how Africa has the world's wealth, the oil, the diamonds, the gold, the land, the people. There's 1 billion people, and Africa is so poor. There's a reason for that. There's a reason the Native Americans almost don't exist anymore. People think that Native Americans were like small in number. No, they're small in number now. They were on this continent in the United States, coast to coast, big cities. You don't know that, but I do. So again, the frequency of slave ships coming, the demand, if you will, is really the source of these transatlantic slave trade. And Hillary Fordwich, failing to mention that, really casts a different light on how folks on the right will view the slave trade. They really, really like that talking point. They really like that Don Lemon said nothing or that he ran out of time. They love that. They're like, yeah, that's right. Go back to Africa and get your money. Okay, we'll get there. So, another thing that I want to mention is that in the tribal Africa, if you were a slave, you entered into a tribe, you were a servant, things that we know. You took on the name of the people who owned you, which is similar to what happened, in the U.S. and, Britain and the colonies and so forth. But you were a soul, an individual. Your children were not born into servitude, many times you would be free upon your master's death. If you outlived your master, you'd be freed, upon their death. Right. So again, it's not the sort of thing where, okay, when I die, all my slaves are going to transfer to my children, that sort of a thing, you had the ability to right yourself in future generations. There weren't oppressive systemic systems in place to privilege one group of people disproportionately and adversely affect one other group of people disproportionately, right? And another thing that I want to mention too is that, let's look at who benefited from slavery. Let's look at who still benefits from the legacy of slavery, okay, if we're talking about reparations. So if in fact it was the sort of thing where Hillary Fordwich was saying was 100% true, which I get why it's such a juicy argument, because, if that were possible, then obviously we'd be all over it. But as I mentioned, a lot of these countries fell to foreign powers. They were taken advantage of, wiped out. Let's talk about the Dahomey tribe. Okay, the Dahomey tribe was the most prolific of the slave trading tribes, right? There's a movie, The Woman King, that talks about, these people. So just to give you a little bit of insight, but there's a little bit more history there, a lot more history, in fact. So, the way the story of the Dahomey goes, the Dahomey kingdom, is that they were conquered by the French over territory, right? So, if we black people wanted reparations from the Dahomey kingdom, well, they don't exist, but the French do. And the Dahomey Kingdom does not benefit from the legacy of slavery. The French do. And if the Dahomey Kingdom was around right now, absolutely, we could go to the Dahomey Kingdom and say, hey, reparations are due to these conquered tribes for these injustices, human injustices committed, these atrocities. And we could go to the French and to the British and to the Americans. But the Dahomey don't exist anymore. Again, the kingdom was wiped out. The French came with big guns and took what they wanted, as is common in history when, unfortunately, our Caucasian brothers and sisters show up to new lands and they bring along their guns and they bring along their diseases and take what they want, right? And rewrite the history oftentimes, so that they don't look as bad as, as we know that it was. Now, I'm not the sort of person that holds that over the head of, white people. I realize that this stuff happened long before I was born. But I do recognize that the legacy of these things, if we're going to address them, let's put everything on the table. Okay. I have no problem saying that Africans sold Africans into slavery because it's true. Okay. I'm not going to make a religious argument. I'm going to make a moral argument. Okay. If we understand that there was something that needs to be remedied, if we can see the legacy of it, if we can see who benefits and who still suffers as a result of it, then we should be compelled morally to address it appropriately. And again, Hillary Fordwich's argument suggests that, we should start at Africa. And even if the Dahomey Kingdom or any of these other kingdoms was still around, it's such a cop-out. It's akin to saying, so imagine yourself. Let's say you work 2 jobs. Okay. You work for me and you work for your next door neighbor. Okay. And your next door neighbor hasn't paid you your money yet for a completely separate job that you've done. Right. And you come to me and you say, hey, Ramses, I did my job. You benefited. It cost me my time and I would like to be paid now. If I were to say to you, well, I'm not going to pay. You need to go to him first. If he pays you, well, wait a minute. Why do I need to go to him? Well, you did work for him. He hasn't paid you yet. Well, no, I did my work for you. I'm talking to you. You entered into this arrangement with me. It's a separate thing. You owe me the money. And you'd be absolutely right. And I would be wrong. As is Hillary Fordwich's argument, saying, oh, you need to go back to the supply. Again, I went to business school. I went to business school 2 times. I have a master's degree hanging on my wall. One thing that I know, supply follows demand. You create the demand and then you'll get a supply. Okay. And then the moral argument, speaks for itself. If you are seeking your compensation, you should get compensation from both areas, and one should not be tied to the other. Okay. In other words, if Africans sold Africans into slavery, that is, one government, if you will, governmental body that has committed an atrocity. And if another country allowed and encouraged and supported and, supplemented and, what's the word I'm looking for? Subsidized, slavery. And we can still see the legacy and the benefits to overwhelmingly a certain group of people that look a certain way. And we could see the adverse effects to another group of people who look a different way. And we can see the slavery and we can address it. Then one outcome should not be tied to the other. Again, you had the analogy yourself. If you did 2 jobs for me and your neighbor, your payment from me should not hinge on whether or not your neighbor pays you. Okay. And if you agree with that, then there's your equivalency. I don't believe it to be a false one. So I think that adding more elements to this conversation, you start to see that, this sort of thing is much more complicated than, well, you should just go back to the supply and give those 2,000 soldiers that died on the high sea. It's much more complicated than that. And it would be nice if our brothers and sisters on the right, who are often white and see the world through that lens, could see beyond, their own limitations. But, it's up to us to kind of have these conversations, and, we'll get there together. One of the things that I try to do is leave a little bit of room for, people to be wrong, people to make mistakes, people to say the wrong thing. Have a little bit of grace, understand that we're all human beings and we're trying to learn our lessons. I'm 40 years old. There's a lot of people a lot older than me, but I am their elder in that my people are older. Our story is older. And I try to think that, okay, this is a young people. They have a lot to learn. And these are my sisters and these are my brothers. And I try not to let things get to me, but also, you know me well enough to know I wasn't going to let this lady get that off. So I'll leave it right there. And as always, if you disagree or if you have anything to offer, please hit me up. I'm on all social media at RamsesJah. I'd love to hear from you. If you say something compelling enough, we'll put it on the show. We'll talk about it some more. We'll get there together. All right. Until next time, y'all. Peace. This has been a production of the Black Information Network. Today's show is produced by Chris Thompson. Have some thoughts you'd like to share? Use the red microphone talkback feature on the iHeartRadio app. While you're there, be sure to hit subscribe and download all of our episodes. I am your host, RamsesJah, on all social media. Join us tomorrow as we share our news with our voice, from our perspective, right here on the Black Information Network Daily Podcast.